One day the walls of the fortress stood tall, echoing the measured tramp of the disciplined cohorts. The next, there was only silence, a terrifying, echoing void where law, order, and protection used to be. The centralized power of the civilized world had just performed a self-inflicted evacuation, and the moment the last imperial galley disappeared over the horizon, Britain became the most vulnerable, most dangerous place on earth. They left behind the Romanized Britons, a people softened by centuries of Pax Romana, stripped of their ancestral martial identity, and taught to rely solely on the shield of the emperor. They were standing naked and afraid on the very shores where the true monsters, the sea wolves of Germania, were gathering in unprecedented numbers. No one knew how to fight anymore. They had traded battle steel for bureaucratic comfort, and the price for that complacency was about to come due with relentless, agonizing interest. Look out across the churning, cold expanse of the North Sea in the 5th century AD. Feel the mist, thick with the smell of brine and unspeakable dread. That water, which for centuries had served as Rome's defensive moat, suddenly transformed into the superhighway for the apocalypse. It was a terrifying, organized invasion, not of settlers seeking peace, but of hungry, savage shadows driven by a chilling ancestral imperative to take everything. We speak now of the Jutes, the Angles, and the Saxons, but do not make the fatal mistake of imagining quaint, peaceful farmers arriving with seed bags and plows. Think instead of a plague of ravens descending upon a massive, rotting carcass. These were the pirates from the darkest, coldest marshes of Germania, men whose entire existence was predicated on violence, men who viewed Britain not as land to cultivate, but as ultimate treasure to be plundered, extinguished, and renamed. Their arrival was not a peaceful immigration wave. It was a shattering, geological event that would redefine the culture, language, and very landscape of the island forever. Imagine the sheer, soul-crushing terror of watching those long, terrifying ships, the sharp, dragon-headed keels, slicing through the cold waves, hitting the undefended beaches of the East Coast. Every man aboard was a trained, hardened killer, forged by a life lived outside the light of civilization. The coastal watchtowers, once vigilantly manned by alert Roman sentinels, were now empty, their signaling fires long dead and cold. And the Britons, the descendants of the mighty Celts, could only watch in paralyzing horror as the first wave of true darkness landed on their ancestral home. The air was split by a war cry unlike anything they had ever heard, a guttural, merciless sound, signaling the definitive end of their world. But here is the most shocking twist of all. The betrayal so catastrophic, so breathtakingly foolish, that it stands as one of the greatest political blunders in recorded human history. The Saxons did not just arrive by chance. They were invited. The desperate, leaderless British rulers, drowning in chaos and unable to repel the vicious raiding Picts and Scots from the north, made the ultimate deal with the devil. They called upon these very Germanic tribes, the very people Rome had struggled for centuries to contain and push back, offering them immense gold and a foothold of land, the Isle of Thanet, in exchange for mercenary protection. They essentially hired a wildfire, a force of merciless destruction, to put out a small brush fire, guaranteeing the destruction of their own future. Can you truly believe the audacity, the sheer, terrifying short-sightedness of such a plea? Hengist and Horsa. These names are not just ancient historical figures. They are the harbingers of doom, the cunning, ruthless wolves who immediately sniffed out the absolute weakness and desperation of their new employers. They looked at the green, fertile land and the panicked, vulnerable Britons, and they knew in their hardened hearts the contract was about to be renegotiated permanently, and it would be sealed in blood at the point of a spear. The mercenaries performed their initial duty perfectly. They annihilated the northern raiders, stabilizing the immediate crisis. But once the job was done, they did not sail home in thanks and glory. Oh no. They looked at the small piece of land promised to them, then looked at all the surrounding undefended territory, and realized the immense potential for absolute, total conquest. Why settle for a few farms when they could seize an entire island ripe for the taking? They immediately sent word back across the sea to their tribes. Britain is ripe. The soft Romans are gone. The native people are weak and have forgotten how to fight. Come. And the great exodus began. The initial trickle of opportunistic warriors became a devastating, unstoppable flood of families, fighters, and entire tribes pouring across the North Sea in a migration that would fundamentally erase, rename, and culturally rebuild an entire corner of the map. This saga is not the history of slow, peaceful settlement, the kind historians politely describe. This is the brutal, terrifying story of a hostile takeover, a centuries-long war of cultural annihilation, where every single inch of soil was paid for in relentless, grinding bloodshed. The Saxons didn't just move in politely. They carved their kingdom out of the living, screaming flesh of Britain. We left the civilized world, the world built on straight roads and bathhouses, imploding. The imperial structure, the very skeleton of safety, had dissolved into dust, leaving the poor, bewildered, and utterly defenseless Romano-British population staring into the abyss. They thought the legions would return, but the message from Emperor Honorius in 410 AD was cold, definitive, and fatal. Look to your own defenses. It was a death warrant delivered by parchment. This wasn't just an external threat. It was societal cannibalism. The local elites, the sophisticated Romanized landowners and administrators known as the curiales, who had grown impossibly soft under 2 centuries of guaranteed peace, immediately started fighting amongst themselves, scrambling for the last vestiges of power, coin, and precious grain stores. They were not warriors, they were bureaucrats suddenly handed the keys to a kingdom on fire. The infrastructure of Britain, the marvelous water systems, the trade networks, the very supply lines that fed the highly specialized Roman life, became instantly unsustainable. Famine was the first executioner to arrive, followed swiftly and mercilessly by the long, terrifying blades of the Picts from the north and the opportunistic Gaelic raiders from the western seas. The island was fracturing, desperately searching for a savior that would never arrive. Now imagine the depth of the desperation. The British leaders, paralyzed by their own incompetence and the constant, soul-shattering raids, decided upon a strategy so monumentally stupid, so historically catastrophic, that it remains the single greatest political miscalculation in the history of the Isles. They looked across the narrow, churning sea, not for allies, but for professional, blood-hungry killers. They were seeking a temporary fix, an immediate solution to the bloody Pictish problem, blinded by their panic. They sought the foederati, federated troops, mercenaries, the very people Rome had occasionally hired to manage its dirtiest, most barbaric wars on the fringes of the empire. They were looking for a shield to hold back the tide of destruction. What they found with the arrival of the first longships was an utterly insatiable wolf. The deal they proposed was simple and disastrously short-sighted. Protection in exchange for land grants and consistent payment. The specific target for this fateful invitation was a cluster of terrifying tribes known collectively and dreadfully as the Saxons. But who were these Saxons, these figures of legend and slaughter? We are talking about a terrifying amalgamation of seafaring tribes from the low-lying northern German plains and the Jutland Peninsula. There were the Angles, ferocious dwellers of Angeln, the Jutes, hardy, pragmatic sailors from Jutland, and the Saxons themselves, infamous for their short, single-edged, deadly fighting knife, the Sikhs, from which they derived their very name. They were not peaceful, land-hungry farmers seeking fertile fields. They were seasoned, vicious pirates, seeking only loot, conquest, and the thrill of the kill. They were experts in taking what wasn't theirs. The first recorded, and therefore most infamous invitation, came around the mid-5th century, specifically placed by a desperate British leader, perhaps the legendary Vortigern. Though his historical existence is often debated, the magnitude of the mistake is not. He needed bodies, hard, ruthless bodies, to repel the Picts who were flooding over the now abandoned Hadrian's Wall like a tidal wave of imaginable destruction. He paid gold. He offered land, and he signed the death warrant for Roman Britain. The first foothold was established in the very corner of the island, the wealthy, accessible region of Kent. Hengist and Horsa, figures of legendary brutality and cunning, arrived with their longships packed with warriors, their axes sharp, and their eyes fixed on the immense riches of the crumbling province. They were granted the Isle of Thanet, a seemingly small, strategic patch of land separated by a narrow channel, to use as a base of operations. This tiny grant of land, this small beachhead, became the aggressive, metastasizing cancer that would eventually consume the entire island. The Saxons, in a cruel twist of irony, did their initial job with breathtaking, surgical violence. They pushed back the Picts, annihilating the northern threat that had paralyzed the Britons for decades. But as they fought, they looked around. They saw soft targets everywhere, undefended Roman villas waiting to be plundered, disorganized and pathetic local governments, and a population that had forgotten how to wield a sword. They didn't see a grateful employer. They saw a buffet laid out for their taking. The shift in perspective was instantaneous and devastating. Their demands began to escalate almost immediately. The payments were deemed insufficient. The land granted was suddenly too small. The food rations promised by the trembling British administrators were deemed not adequate for the needs of our mighty warriors who defend your worthless lives. This was no longer negotiation over contract terms. This was outright extortion under arms, backed by thousands of terrifying, battle-hardened men who feared neither God nor the Britons who signed their checks. And then the signal went out, carried by returning longships across the frigid northern sea. The initial contingent sent a message back to their homelands. The island is ripe. The people are weak and unarmed. The land is ours for the taking, rich beyond imagining. The trickle of opportunistic mercenaries became an unstoppable deluge of conquest. Wave after wave of longships, packed shoulder to shoulder with hardened warriors from the continent, began to crash onto the eastern shores of Britain, seeking permanent, bloody settlement. The establishment of the foundational Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, Sussex, South Saxons, Wessex, West Saxons, Essex, East Saxons, and later the mighty kingdoms of the Angles like Northumbria and Mercia, was not a peaceful integration, dear listener. It was a violent, generation-long process of ethnogenesis. The British were either killed outright, brutally enslaved, or driven screaming westward into the cold mountainous regions, into what would eventually become known as Wales, the land of the Waleas, or foreigners, as their conquerors derisively called them. This wasn't a transition period in the historical sense. It was an apocalypse written in fire and iron, a brutal replacement of one world by another. The very foundations of the island were ripped up and replaced with a brutal, pagan warrior hierarchy. And the terror, the relentless, history-altering invasion, had only just begun. We are only scratching the surface of the blood libel that birthed the Anglo-Saxon world, but if you manage to survive that chapter without falling asleep, congratulations. The nightmare deepens. You survived the initial onslaught of the arrival, but now the real terror begins. If you thought the introduction of Hengist and Horsa was the climax of this horrifying tale, you were deeply mistaken. That was merely the sound of the first match striking dry kindling in a world ready to burn. Now the fire spreads, consuming Britain in an unprecedented wave of violence that makes the Roman withdrawal look like a peaceful retirement party. Vortigern, the self-proclaimed High King, the man who signed the death warrant for his own people, suddenly realized the catastrophic nature of his transaction. The Jutes, led by the Brothers of Damnation, were not content with a patch of land on the Isle of Thanet, the desolate marshland they were initially promised. They tasted the weak blood of Britain, smelled the rich soil left fallow by the legions, and they wanted everything, demanding endless supplies of grain, clothing, and outright gold, far beyond what the fractured British economy could produce. Towns that had survived 400 years of iron-fisted Roman occupation were now put to the torch by a foe far more ruthless and opportunistic. London, once the jewel of Britannia, likely saw the billowing black smoke long before the invaders arrived. The agonizing descriptions left by the chronicler Gildas speak of public and private ruins, the priesthood being slaughtered upon the very altars they served, and a people fleeing like hunted animals into the dense, dark, unforgiving forests of the West. For a generation, it was pure, unadulterated chaos, the great British retreat, the death rattle of a 1,000-year-old civilization. But in the darkest night, sometimes a spark of defiance ignites, a flicker of hope that refuses to be extinguished. Enter the man who would become the historical foundation for the legend we whisper about even today, Ambrosius Aurelianus. He was not a peasant or a tribal chieftain. He was the last true Roman, a man of high birth, possibly the sole surviving heir of a Roman magistrate, desperately holding on to the dying embers of civilization and order. Ambrosius was the necessary counterforce, the general who finally gathered the terrified, scattered British resistance, instilling in them the one concept the Saxons had yet to master: unified, disciplined strategy. He understood that the Saxons were not a single, unified army under one banner, but a swarm of independent, greedy warbands, each looking for the easiest kill. To defeat them, the Britons needed Roman military discipline, married to Celtic ferocity, and a will to die for their homeland. This was not a mere skirmish. It was an apocalyptic confrontation that likely took place around the year 500 AD, where the British forces finally unified under a brilliant commander, whether Ambrosius himself or the figure he inspired, stood shoulder to shoulder on that high ground, fighting not for land or gold, but for the very survival of their culture, their memory, and their souls. The terrible, terrifying act of betrayal that brought the Saxons ashore was just the prologue. The true, gut-wrenching horror began immediately after, a slow-motion, relentless blitzkrieg that consumed the island. If you thought the initial warbands were bad, understand this: the gates of the continent had been opened, and the North Sea was now a highway for conquest, not trade.
The fires began in Kent and spread like a plague across the fertile lowlands. The great Roman roads, once symbols of imperial order, now served as invasion routes for war bands whose loyalty was only to the sword and the chieftain who wielded it most effectively. The last flickering remnants of Latin civilization were being extinguished, one burning villa and abandoned town at a time.
Imagine the desperation. Your ancestors built this island, tamed it with legions, and now you are facing an enemy who rejects everything you value, your laws, your gods, your very language. The Romano-Britons, refugees in their own land, were pushed back, century by century, into the harsh, unforgiving West, into the mountains and the peninsulas. But the resistance was not instantly crushed. From the smoking ruins, the final leaders of the British people emerged, desperately trying to reforge the broken shield of Rome. This is the moment, steeped in blood and the deepest mists of history, where the legendary figure of Arthur steps on to the bloody stage.
He was likely not a king in shining armor, but a dux bellorum, a terrifyingly effective warlord who understood strategy and cavalry charges better than the Germanic invaders. His victories, though few, were seismic, none more so than the mythical Battle of Mons Badonicus, a cataclysmic clash that allegedly granted the Britons a reprieve.
For an entire generation, the Saxon advance was supposedly checked, held in agonizing, suspenseful stasis by the sheer terror of the British counterstrike. But even the greatest victory cannot stem a demographic tide. While the West held, the East solidified its terrifying grip. The Saxons were not going home. They were digging in, carving out their new territories based on tribal identity and the sheer, brutal fact of possession. This chaotic, violent territorial division is the birth of the Heptarchy, the terrifying 7 kingdoms that would dominate the next 4 centuries of conflict. Every boundary was drawn in blood, every alliance was temporary, and every king was perpetually looking over his shoulder. In the north, the Angles were coalescing into the massive, aggressive power of Northumbria, a kingdom built on conquest and the subjugation of the old British North. To the south, the West Saxons, the future Wessex, were a relentlessly expanding military machine, constantly pressing the remnants of the British kingdoms towards the sea. Meanwhile, Mercia, the terrifying Middle Kingdom, was rising, a dark inland power that specialized in absorbing and dominating its neighbors. The cultural annihilation accompanying this conquest was unique in the history of the Western Empire. Unlike Gaul, where the invaders adopted Roman language and law, in Britain, the Germanic tongue replaced the Latin. The old language did not just fade, it was systematically driven out, a linguistic genocide mirroring the physical one. Cities were not merely taken over, they were abandoned. The Saxons preferred the open field, the farmstead, the small village, rejecting the complex, centralized administration of Rome. The intricate infrastructure, the baths, the forums, the carefully maintained roads, began to crumble, victims of neglect and outright hostility. This wasn't just a political regime change. It was the complete dismantling of a 400-year-old high civilization, a terrifying plunge into what is accurately described as the Dark Ages, a period where written records vanish and the only history is told by the screams of the defeated.
And from this chaos, the first great Saxon kings emerged, not as benevolent rulers, but as hyper-competent warlords, whose legitimacy was forged entirely in battle. Take Ethelbert of Kent, a king of terrifying ambition whose strategic coastal position made him wealthy and powerful enough to claim the title of Bretwalda, the temporary, terrifying overlord of the other kingdoms.
The reckoning, as promised, arrived not as a sudden cataclysmic event, but as a slow, grinding terror that lasted for centuries, leaching the very life force out of the landscape. The hopeful priests, those spiritual heirs of Saint Germanus who dreamed of a unified Christian Britain rising from Roman ashes, found their new cathedrals being built on the bones of their predecessors, a horrifying sacrilegious foundation laid by men who worshipped Woden and Tiw. The fragile dream of civilization died screaming, replaced by the tribal fury of the invading Germanic tribes, who now saw the entire island as their unquestionable birthright. Think not of neat borders, but of vast, shifting hunting grounds, where only the most terrifying, ruthless warlords survived the lunar cycle. Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. These were the names carved into the landscape with swords, each one a death sentence for any remaining British enclave that dared stand in their path of absolute expansion. Let us look first at Kent, the original landing site, the beachhead of betrayal, where the ghost of Hengist still stalked the marshlands, demanding tribute and sacrifice. Kent was the first kingdom to formalize its terror, settling into a pattern of rule that was rigid and chillingly efficient, designed entirely for the subjugation of the native population. Their proximity to the continent meant they were constantly refreshed with new blood, new weapons, and new, more brutal pagan deities demanding ritualistic sacrifice. The Jutes, who dominated Kent, were masters of coastal raiding, and their laws, some of the earliest written in England, were designed not for justice or mercy, but for the absolute control of a captive population, placing a clear price, a weregild, on every single human life. A price that was drastically lower for a captured Briton than for a free Saxon. This was systematized humiliation, backed by the ever-present threat of the axe, the very blueprint for the future English state, built upon the bedrock of racial and military supremacy. But if Kent was the wound that started the infection, it was Wessex, the West Saxons, that became the cancer, spreading relentlessly and unstoppably across the entire south of the island, demanding ever more territory. The story of Wessex is one of pure, unadulterated expansion, fueled by a terrifying, cold-blooded efficiency that bordered on military genius. Their kings, the descendants of the legendary, almost mythological Cerdic, were not just fierce warriors. They were calculating conquerors who understood logistics, supply lines, and the systematic, methodical eradication of native resistance from the fertile lowlands. The advance of Wessex meant the complete annihilation of the British kingdoms in the lush river valleys, pushing the indigenous population out of their ancestral homes with devastating force. Imagine the sound that defined those decades, not just the clash of steel on the shield wall, but the horrific silence that followed, where entire villages were emptied, their history erased, their language replaced by the grinding, guttural tongue of the new overlords, a language that carried the heavy scent of blood and dirt. For the native Britons, these decades were an apocalyptic nightmare, where the sun seemed to refuse to shine on their defiant hopes. They retreated, not just geographically, into the mountain strongholds of Wales, Cymru, and the desperate coasts of Cornwall, but psychologically, watching their world burn and fall into the hands of barbarians. They watched the ancestral lands, the Roman roads, the fields they had tilled for 1,000 years, the sacred groves, fall to invaders who cared nothing for their history or their Christian God. This forced retreat defined the future of the entire island, creating the indelible line between the English and the Welsh. The foreign term Wales, used by the Saxons, simply meaning foreigner, stranger, or even slave. The true horror of this period, however, lies not just in the conquest of the Britons, but in the constant, fratricidal struggle for supremacy among the 7 kingdoms themselves, the brutal pursuit of the title Bretwalda, the Wide Ruler, or Britain Ruler. This was not a diplomatic title handed out by peaceful negotiation. It was a temporary, bloody mandate achieved by overwhelming military force and mass slaughter, signaling that one king was powerful enough to extract tribute, hostages, and absolute obedience from all the others, whether they liked it or not. The stage is now set for the most terrifying period of all, the rise of the central kingdoms, the landlocked giants who cared nothing for the sea, only for the utter domination of the interior. Northumbria will briefly flash like a glorious, brutal comet, but it is Mercia, the kingdom of the marches, built on sheer, terrifying military might and strategic ruthlessness, that is preparing to enter the ring. Mercia is preparing to become the true master of the Saxon world, a dominion so vast and absolute that it would take an act of divine intervention, or perhaps something much, much darker and more pagan, to finally bring its oppressive power low. Prepare yourself, for the shield wall is about to become an unbreakable, land-hungry fortification, and the blood is about to start flowing across the Midlands like a dark, unstoppable river. We are far from sleep, my friends, miles and centuries away from any semblance of peace. The betrayal wasn't a slow burn. It was a sudden, blinding detonation of treachery that ripped the fragile fabric of British society apart, confirming the worst fears of every Romanized Briton who had begged the legions to stay. Vortigern, the High King, or perhaps the High Fool, depending on your perspective, had made a deal with the devil, and now the devils were collecting their exorbitant fee, measured in vast tracts of land and rivers of blood. Hengist and Horsa, those two spectral figures of conquest, had barely put down their shields before the list of demands started escalating past the point of reason, past the point of possibility, spiraling into pure, cynical extortion, designed not to sustain their troops, but to cripple their hosts. "We need more grain," they hissed, their voices already growing colder, less respectful, filled with the deep, rumbling confidence of men who knew they held the ultimate leverage, their lethal presence. "Our families are starving. Our warriors are many." But they weren't just asking for food to survive. They were demanding the very sustenance that kept the remaining British strongholds alive, intentionally weakening their hosts to the point of collapse, preparing the field for the final harvest of conquest. The Britons, already struggling under the weight of self-defense and agricultural decline following the Roman withdrawal, simply could not meet the rapacious demands of these Germanic warlords, nor did they possess the military might to refuse them without immediate, devastating consequences. And then came the truly terrifying part of the bargain, the continuous, relentless arrival of reinforcements, far beyond what any mercenary contract would stipulate. Every spring, the treacherous North Sea would vomit up another wave of longships, packed shoulder to shoulder with Jutes, Angles, and more Saxons, hungry, lethal, and utterly without mercy, transforming the mercenary contingent into a full-scale invading army. These weren't diplomats seeking peaceful settlement. These were legions of shock troops arriving on Britain's shores, invited by the very people they were destined to destroy. A catastrophic, self-inflicted wound of apocalyptic proportions. The tension became so thick, so poisonous, that a single misplaced glance, a single failed delivery of grain, could ignite the whole island in an unstoppable inferno. Vortigern finally realized, with a sickening, gut-wrenching dread that must have kept him screaming in his sleep, that he hadn't hired guards. He had invited executioners into his own courtyard, signing the death warrant for the last vestiges of Roman Britain. The breaking point was brutal, inevitable, and drowned in the bitter salt spray of the Thames estuary. The Saxons, having secured their initial foothold in Kent, dropped the mask of the loyal Federati entirely and revealed the terrifying face of the rapacious invader. The contract was null and void, ripped up and scattered on the wind like worthless parchment, replaced only by the code of the sword. They turned on their erstwhile masters with the concentrated ferocity of cornered wolves, seizing the grain supplies, torching the sprawling villas that symbolized the Romanized life, and systematically dismantling every piece of remaining Roman infrastructure that the desperate Britons desperately clung to for safety and stability. This was not merely a skirmish or a border dispute. This was the great fire of Britain, raging uncontrollably from the southeast coast inland, transforming the once civilized landscape into a smoking wasteland. Cities that had stood for 400 years under the protection of the eagle now became pyres, columns of thick black smoke, serving as horrific beacons of Saxon victory and British defeat. The British response, initially paralyzed by shock and completely disorganized by their fragmented regional leadership, began to coalesce around a single towering figure, a true son of the empire, Ambrosius Aurelianus. If Vortigern was the embodiment of fatal folly and short-sighted desperation, then Ambrosius was the desperate last gasp of military, noble Romanized Britain, the last flicker of organized resistance against the Germanic darkness sweeping across the plains. He was a man steeped in the old ways, a true Roman aristocrat who had somehow survived the initial chaos, possessing the military acumen, the strategic patience, and the sheer, unyielding will needed to challenge the relentless Saxon tide that threatened to drown the entire island. He represented the final, flickering hope that the island would not be swallowed whole by the northern darkness and descend into irreversible barbarism. The ensuing conflict was not fought with grand set-piece battles. Not yet. Those would come later, soaked in legend. It was a vicious, grinding war of attrition, fought in the deep, confusing forests, along the muddy, forgotten rivers, and within the shattered, crumbling remains of old hilltop forts. Imagine the terror, watching your neighbor's farm burn, listening to the shrieking approach of the longships, knowing that the guttural language of the invaders was violently replacing the familiar cadence of Latin and Old British, realizing that an entire civilization was being violently scrubbed from the map, replaced by a terrifying new order. This was the era where history blurred irrevocably into legend, where every minor victory became a desperate, celebrated saga, and every defeat meant the total annihilation of a community, its people either enslaved or slaughtered. The Saxons, having completed their betrayal, carved out their first solid kingdom, Kent, the first crucial beachhead for 1,000 years of future conquest. The defensive line was thin, stretched impossibly tight across the spine of Britain, a desperate shield against a relentless hammer. Ambrosius and his surviving commanders were fighting a holding action, trying to stem the national hemorrhage while organizing a unified counterstrike, something the fragmented Britons hadn't achieved since the legions departed for good. But the invaders kept coming, wave after unstoppable wave, pushed by population pressure and the promise of rich, fertile land. The name Anglo-land was beginning to form, slowly, brutally, etched in the deep blood and consuming fire of the conquered territory. We are now standing on the very precipice of the true Age of Iron and Darkness, where the last lights of civilization dimmed to mere struggling embers. Sleep is impossible here, my friends. The air is thick with the smoke of burning villages,
and the only soundtrack is the continuous, unforgiving clash of iron and the desperate screams of the betrayed. We must push on, deeper into the dark heart of the Saxon advance, before the entire island drowns completely in the relentless, icy tide.
This was the dawn of the infamous Heptarchy, a term that sounds like a dry historical footnote, but in reality, it was 700 years of ceaseless, agonizing war played out across the shattered ruins of Britannia. Forget peace. The game was simply one of survival, where yesterday's ally was tomorrow's sacrifice on the altar of expansion, where trust was a weakness immediately exploited.
From the ashes of the Roman dream rose the names that would define a millennium of conflict: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Sussex, Kent, and the colossal, future-defining shadow of Wessex. These were not borders drawn on maps. They were lines of freshly dug earth, guarded by men whose only skill was the swift delivery of death. Men who knew nothing but the language of the spear.
Let us pivot first to the southeastern tip, to the fertile lands of Kent, the very landing point where the original, fatal invitation was issued. Here, the Jutes, a distinct cousin to the Saxons and Angles, established their initial poisonous grip, leveraging their early arrival into a precarious wealth and a dangerous reputation. Hengist's legacy, whether myth or monstrous reality, flowered here, forcing the local Britons into abject servitude and establishing a complex web of alliances and betrayals with the continental powers. Kent became the gateway, the first permanent, undeniable beachhead of the invaders. Its early rulers, perhaps even claiming direct lineage from the mythical founders, understood the strategic importance of control over the narrow seas and the flow of imported luxuries, making them targets of intense envy. But this early stability was deceptive. It was merely a pressure cooker, waiting to explode.
Every other fledgling kingdom looked at Kent's burgeoning wealth with hungry, wolfish eyes, setting the standard for the inevitable, brutal power struggle that would define the entire Heptarchy era, a conflict where the spoils went to the most brutal and least sentimental.
But the true heart of the emerging terror lay in the Midlands, in the colossal, landlocked savagery of Mercia. Imagine a kingdom defined not by the sea, but by the dark forests and rich, contested river valleys, a place where strength was measured by the depth of your inland defense. Mercia was the brute strength of the Heptarchy, the hammer forged in the furnace of conquest, relentless and uncompromising in its drive for land and tribute. Its initial expansion was a horrifying tidal wave, pushing west with unstoppable force. They crushed the remaining British kingdoms into the desolate mountains of Wales, forcing them to adopt the name Welsh, a term meaning simply foreigners or strangers, a bitter mark of defeat forced upon them by their conquerors.
The Mercians were obsessed with control, establishing vast earthworks and defenses, like the mighty Offa's Dyke, an enduring monument to their paranoid ambition.
carving out an empire that relied on raw military might and the absolute subjugation of the surrounding tribes. They set their sights not merely on survival, but on absolute dominion over the entire island, seeing their smaller rivals as mere obstacles to be crushed beneath their war boots, treating the lesser kings like subservient puppets whose strings they constantly tightened. Far to the north, beyond the ruins of Hadrian's Wall, lay Northumbria. This was the most volatile and exposed of the early Saxon empires, constantly battered by the furious resistance of the Picts and the native peoples of what would become Scotland. Their kings were warriors of immense, almost reckless ambition, ruling over a land that stretched from the Humber estuary deep into the Caledonian wilderness. Life here was a constant, icy struggle against hostile terrain and equally hostile neighbors, always one failed harvest away from famine, or one decisive battle away from total annihilation. This northern expanse, however, held a strange, unexpected vulnerability. Due to its proximity to the Celtic Christian heartlands in Iona and the Irish Sea, it became the first major center where the ancient, blood-soaked paganism of the Saxons was seriously challenged by the quiet, persuasive whispers of the Christian faith. It was a deadly political tightrope walk, often resulting in spectacular royal betrayals and violent reversions to the old gods, leading to civil wars that tore the kingdom apart from the inside, often pitting brother against brother in conflicts decided over the nature of God. The defining feature of this terrifying era was the ceaseless jockeying for the title of Bretwalda, the Britain ruler, or wide ruler. This was not a hereditary title. It was a brutal designation earned only through overwhelming military supremacy and the forced submission of rival kings, a crown forged in terror. Every generation saw a new, magnificent warlord rise from the mire, claiming the mantle, only to have it ripped from their grasp by a younger, hungrier king emerging from the shadowed forests of Mercia or the plains of Wessex, eager to prove his worth through superior savagery. The Bretwalda was the ultimate expression of Saxon ambition, a temporary, magnificent tyranny that held the fractured island together through sheer, unadulterated terror and the relentless demand for tribute. When the Bretwalda died, chaos inevitably erupted anew. The cycle of invasion, consolidation, and civil strife spun violently onward, ensuring that peace remained a fleeting, impossible dream. This period, often labeled the Dark Ages by later historians, was in fact an age blindingly bright with the constant flash of battle axes and the inferno of burning settlements. It was the forging of England in a crucible of endless war, where the only reliable currency was steel and the unwavering loyalty of your thegns, your warrior retinue, who were rewarded for their faithfulness with land and plunder. And what of the people caught beneath this crushing historical millstone? For the native Britons, it was a living nightmare of displacement, slavery, and cultural annihilation.
their very identity systematically erased by the relentless advance of the German tongue.
Their language receded into the mountainous peripheries. Their Romanized towns crumbled into silent ruins, and their very existence was relegated to the margins of the new power structure. Even for the average Saxon farmer or warrior, life was brutal, short, and defined by the whims of their lord. The expectation was absolute military service, loyalty unto death, and the constant fear of sudden, devastating raids from a neighboring kingdom seeking to prove its Bretwalda credentials. Society was rigid, stratified by wealth and martial ability, where the difference between a free man and a slave could be decided in a single, disastrous battle. The law codes, slowly beginning to be written down in rough, intimidating runes, were unforgiving, built upon the principle of vengeance and massive compensation payments, the weregild, for every perceived slight or murder. It was an environment of constant existential pressure. Yet within this high-pressure cooker, the first true elements of a unified English identity began, paradoxically, to simmer, born not of peaceful unity, but of shared, brutal survival against an equally brutal fate. The desperate struggle for survival against the initial tidal wave of Saxon fury had, against all odds, forged something new in the shattered remains of Britannia. But do not be fooled into thinking the bloodshed had ended. The battle for the island simply shifted its axis, turning inward, becoming more insidious, more complex, and infinitely more bloody. The unified front of terror that had been the invading Angles, Saxons, and Jutes shattered into a volatile kaleidoscope of warring regional power bases, known to history as the Heptarchy, the era of 7 kingdoms. This was the moment the invaders stopped conquering the Britons and started conquering each other in a frantic, terrifying race for ultimate power. 7 kingdoms emerged from the smoke, 7 ambitious, rapacious entities locked in a perpetual, agonizing dance for supremacy. Kent, the first toehold of the invaders, was quickly eclipsed by the rising star of Northumbria in the freezing north, and the dark, aggressive powerhouse of Mercia, sitting right in the volatile heartland. Wessex, the ultimate victor, was still a scrappy, peripheral fighter, learning the terrifying rules of the game. These were not neighbors sharing tea and strategic alliances. These were wolf packs vying for the carcass of Britain. The prize? The title of Bretwalda, the Wide Ruler, or Britain Ruler, a crown soaked in the blood of defeated kin, a temporary license to brutal dominance over the other 6. From the south, across the same dark water the Saxons had used, the shadow of Rome returned, not as legions, but as missionaries, spearheaded by the relentless ambition of Pope Gregory the Great. He dispatched Augustine in 597 AD to land right back where the first invaders had, in Kent, aiming to drag these pagan warrior kings out of the mire of sacrifice and into the light of the cross, or, more accurately, into Rome's political and economic orbit. Augustine's arrival was a geopolitical earthquake disguised as a spiritual awakening. Imagine the sheer, terrifying dissonance. A king like Raedwald of East Anglia, celebrated for his magnificent pagan burial ship at Sutton Hoo, suddenly considering kneeling before a single, meek god who preached patience and eternal reward. This was not merely a spiritual journey. It was geopolitical chess played with eternal souls as pawns. The ultimate clash for the heart of the island centered on the titanic struggle between the expansive, newly Christianized Northumbria and the fiercely traditional, terrifyingly efficient pagan Mercia. King Edwin of Northumbria was the first great Christian Bredwalda, an emperor of the north, whose authority was so absolute that a man could allegedly walk the entire length of his kingdom without fear of robbery, a staggering feat in this era of chronic banditry. This was the brutal reality of the Heptarchy. Supremacy was fleeting, and the price of failure was total destruction, often reversing years of political and religious progress in a single afternoon of slaughter. But the flame of Northumbria was not extinguished. Enter Oswald, a prince refined in exile, a warrior whose faith was as sharp as his blade. He returned, hardened by defeat, and confronted Penda's alliance at the Battle of Heavenfield.
Oswald dramatically erected a huge wooden cross on the battlefield before the fight, a powerful, defiant symbol of his dedication to the Christian cause and a profound challenge to Penda's pagan might. The miracle, as the chroniclers later called it, was his stunning, decisive victory, re-establishing Northumbria's supremacy and making Oswald the next dominant Bredwalda.
His final act of defiance came at the Battle of the Winwade in 655 AD, where he faced King Oswiu of Northumbria, Oswald's successor. Though outnumbered, Oswiu vowed to dedicate his daughter to the church if he won, a desperate bargain with the divine. But the lessons of the Northumbrian period were clear. Military might and religious legitimacy were inseparable tools of control, both necessary to claim the Bretwalda title. The eventual victor of the Heptarchy would be the kingdom that could master both, the kingdom that could project power further and hold it longer than any other. The stage was now set for the truly ruthless rise of Mercia, the kingdom of Offa, whose walls would define the very borders of England itself.